well, this is different.
The new Z790 Kingpin motherboard from EVGA features a 14-layer PCB, 21-phase VRM, PCIe Gen 5, Wi-Fi 6, and a host of features to unlock the full potential of Intel's new 13th Gen CPU. To see the complete list of features of the Z790 Kingpin motherboard from EVGA, follow the link in the description below.
All right, guys, so since Jay is on vacation, he's entrusted me with these shiny new bad boys, the AMD Radeon 7900 XT and the XTX. These two cards are going to be going up against the RTX 4080 from NVIDIA. We have here the 7900 XTX from AMD, which is $200 cheaper than the 4080, and the XT, which is going to be $300 cheaper than the 4080. So that's a pretty big price gap between these two. Now, does it equal $200 less performance? That's gonna be the interesting thing when we check out the benchmarks. Oh, and I just wanna put out a friendly reminder for you guys that are checking out all of the coverage on the 7900 XTX and XT. Don't forget to check out everybody else's benchmarks as well, because not one reviewer is going to tell the whole story. Not every reviewer is gonna play every game, or not every reviewer is gonna be playing your favorite games. So yeah, cross-reference, check out everybody else's video. There's gonna be obviously a bunch of people. I'm sure your inbox is exploding right now. Don't forget to check those guys out as well, because you always want to get the entire picture when you're talking about benchmarking and checking out how cards perform. Okay, so we know that the 4080 is the primary competitor between these two cards, but today we're also going to be comparing it against its older generation 6950 XT Red Devil. Now, this is the fastest previous gen Radeon card that we have our hands on, so it'll be interesting to see the improvements generation over generation compared to this thing. So these are the four cards that we're testing it against today. I decided to throw in the 4090 in there anyway as well, because it kind of is the benchmark for just like, what's the most FPS that this game can get. So it'll be a nice little comparison between the 4090, 4080, XT and XTXs from the new 7900 series, as well as its previous generation. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and check out the benchmarks, and then we'll talk about how these cards did. And if you guys see me referencing the laptop a lot, I don't have Jay's gift of memorizing everything perfectly and being able to recite all the details, so bear with me a little bit. So yeah, the 4090 FE is on the charts pretty much just as a reference. Like, it's not really a part of today's conversation, but you know, again, it's just thrown in there just so you can see how these cards and the previous generation 6950 XT stack up to the current flagship. If you're going for maximum, like, oh, I don't care how much it costs, I want the most FPS possible, then obviously these cards aren't exactly in your market. You're gonna just buy a 4090 and then not care about any other opinions, and that's totally fine. But the 4080 FE is the one to beat here, and AMD has put up a huge fight with these cards. The 7900 XTX is pretty much just trading blows with the 4080. The fact that it's doing that at its price point of $1,000, which is, or technically $999, but $1,000, which is $200 cheaper than the 4080, and it's trading blows and or beating it, I mean, I don't know what you could say to that besides the fact that, like, there's a lot of people like me that would just keep 200 bucks, go with the 7900 XTX, put that 200 bucks towards something else in your system, maybe some extra RAM, faster processor, especially because you're gonna need it. We'll talk about that later, because bottlenecks are a thing with these cards nowadays, especially if you're running 1080p and 1440p. It's insane that this thing is competing and trading blows with the 4080 to me. Especially, I mean, just look at the size difference right here. This is a normal size graphics card, and this is a giant brick. So not only is it physically smaller and cheaper, it's also giving you the equivalent performance of the 4080 in rasterization. They said that they were gonna compete against the 4080. Turns out, yep, it pretty much is performing around a 4080 for $200 cheaper. So the XTX is doing exactly what AMD said it'd do. But what about the XT? It's $100 cheaper at $900, but it's also noticeably got a little bit of a gap between it and the XTX, but it is $100 cheaper. So, I mean, it kind of just depends on what your budget is for those two cards. So yeah, the price points are pretty straightforward. You know, $200 less than the 4080, get about equivalent performance, $300 less than the 4080, and you get a little bit less performance, but it is pretty much on the heels of the 4080 on most of the benchmarks that we tested. Whether or not that $100 is worth to you, do you want the extra performance so that you can confidently go toe-to-toe with the 4080? Or do you want to save a little bit extra cash, be slightly behind a 4080, but then you can put that 300 bucks that you saved from not getting a 4080 into somewhere else in your system. You're pretty much getting a free other component upgrade without sacrificing much else besides RT performance. AMD's new architecture is just insane. Those chiplets are crazy. Their RT cores are still not as refined and mature as NVIDIA's, which makes sense because NVIDIA kind of got the jump start on everyone with that whole RT core thing in the industry. But before we get into RT discussion in depth, let's go ahead and check out the generation over generation comparison between the XTX, the XT, and the old 6950 XT Red Devil by Power Color. That's a lot of names. Looking at our synthetics real quick, if you check out Times by Extreme, it's pretty much just a straight line between the 6950 and the 7900 XTX, with the 7900 XT being right in the middle of those two. Port Royal is the same case, except obviously the AMD cards take a hit compared to the NVIDIA cards. In titles like Cyberpunk with Ultra at 4K, 45 FPS on the 6950 XT versus 68 on the 7900 XTX, 1440p, 125 FPS versus 99. Now 1440, these cards are a little bottlenecked in 1440 and then definitely bottlenecked in 1080p, so it's a little pointless, but I kept those numbers in the graph just so that you guys could see the sort of bottlenecks that we're running into. Guardians of the Galaxy, if you look at the 4K FPS numbers, pretty much linear from the 6950 XT all the way up to the 7900 XTX. Guardians is a great example of a bottleneck because if you look, the 1440p and the 1080p scores are pretty much just pegged almost to the same number, and in NVIDIA's case, exactly the same number because those cards are so bottlenecked. But yeah, the 7900 XTX and the XT are very good generation over generation uplifts in performance compared to the old 6950 XT. So let's talk about RT performance for a little bit. They have made improvements in their ray tracing cores, but let's be real, it's not going to score as good as an NVIDIA card in ray tracing, but at the same time, I don't feel like it's so bad of performance that you could just write it off as a feature on these AMD cards. You can start playing around with RT stuff with these cards at playable frame rates instead of slideshow frame rates, and it's really crazy to see performant RT on an AMD card. Like it feels like, yeah, it's not as good as NVIDIA, but it's good enough finally, and it's just super nice to see. I mean, check out the Port Royal scores. Like, it's behind the 4080, but it's not like super far behind where you're just like, why even market this feature on these cards? Like, no, these things are pretty solid contenders in ray tracing. Now, while Port Royal looks pretty good, Cyberpunk RT is a little bit of a different story. The cards are still lagging pretty much behind. Now, FSR 2.1 is in Cyberpunk now, so you'll probably get a playable frame rate if you enable FSR and you want to check out Cyberpunk with all the ray tracing goodies turned on. That was just not really an experience that you could have had before Cyberpunk added FSR 2.1. But again, that's exactly why we don't test upscalers when we're testing RT performance like raw like this, because there's an example of a game that didn't have an upscaler and then now it does, and suddenly it opens up that whole like, oh, AMD cards can now try ray tracing without either having their image look super Vaseline jelly smeared all over the monitor or dealing with 5, 10, 15 FPS. I'm really happy with the progress that they've been making on the RT stuff, and FSR 2 is, dare I say it, as good as DLSS, but that's for a different video. So let's move on to any weird anomalies or quirks or anything that I saw in testing with these cards. Not really. I mean, RDNA is pretty mature at this point. I saw one single crash in Tomb Raider, and I think Jay talked about it in one of the videos where he was benchmarking. He said Laura died in the middle of the benchmark. That also happened to me for some reason. I don't know why. And then the game crashed with saying like it was downloading stuff. No weirdness with Hitman like we saw with the Intel Arc cards. It just worked. I installed the driver. I didn't even have trouble installing the driver. And usually the beta drivers or the press drivers are a little finicky, but I really had not a single issue with either of these cards. It was super smooth sailing. The only anomalies that I can really talk about are on the results, and that's specifically the 1440 and 1080p bottlenecks that I was talking about earlier. Specific example would be if you look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the 4K numbers are pretty much the only thing that look reasonable as far as the charts. 1440 and 1080p, you can tell not so much on the 6950 XT, but as you go up the chart, the numbers get closer and closer together and closer to that 250-ish. I'm assuming that's an engine cap because I haven't seen a card get higher than 250 in Shadow of the Tomb Raider yet. The 4090 FE, as you can see, hit 248 in 1080p and 245 in 1440p. I don't think that resolution jump is worth 3 FPS. Only 3 FPS? No, these cards are all bottlenecked, and it's insane to me because these cards are so dang fast. Not just the XT and the XTX that we're talking about today, but like this current generation of cards. I think we need to tell Jay that we need to upgrade our testing rig already. And it's running at 12900K. That's overclocked in there. So another interesting set of benchmark results was Guardians of the Galaxy. Oddly enough, the 7900 XTX scores lower than the XT in 1440 and 1080p. I think that's just weird bottlenecky type quirks. My theory, and this is completely unfounded, don't quote me on this, is that I think the XTX is completing the frames in such little time that it spends more time than the XT idle per frame, waiting for the CPU to give it instructions. So I think it's clocking down a little bit more aggressively than the XT was. That was just the weirdness that you see with these very high-powered cards and trying to run them at, it feels weird to say 1440p is a low resolution, but I mean, for something like this, or this, or this, or even maybe this, 1440 is kind of looking a little bit easy for them now, and they're not really sweating anymore. So it's just moving that bottleneck around your system to, okay, what's the next slowest component? And if your CPU isn't able to keep any of these super hungry GPUs fed, then that's the weirdness that you see. Hitman's one of the oldest titles in our suite, so it kind of makes sense that this engine wouldn't really deal with super high FPS that well. But I mean, you know, one look at that benchmark chart, the 4090 is getting 160 in 4K, 165 in 1440, and then 161 in 1080p. Like, yeah, all of these GPUs in Hitman are pretty much just waiting around for the processor to just throw some frames their way. I guess the takeaway from this is that graphics cards are so powerful this generation that really you're probably gonna need a CPU upgrade. But that's a different story. I think we'll probably do a video about CPU bottlenecks later on. I mean, let us know down in the comments if you want Jay to do a video about CPU bottlenecks in 2020. What year is it? 2? 3? Let's get these guys out of the way because I want to talk about these coolers. I'm gonna grab the XTX because it has an extra X. That means it's cool. It's extra cool. So in our unboxing, Jay thought that the Radeon logo lights up. In fact, I was kind of disappointed to see that the Radeon logo does not light up. Only the XTX has those light strips right here. The X right here on the XT, Jay thought was a light bar, and I kind of did too because the texture of it is different from the rest of the texture, but nope, plugged it in and it was just nothing lit up. So I guess you gotta pay $1,000 if you want lights on your GPU. The XT will not tickle that fancy for you, unfortunately. Speaking about the coolers, let's talk about power draw and temperatures. As you can clearly see, this cooler is significantly smaller than the 4080. Now that we know that the performance is roughly equivalent, what does that mean for temps and noise? Well, I can tell you that the 7900 XTX and also the XT were very quiet. I honestly didn't really hear the fans ramp up at all during testing. They do run a little bit hotter. So for comparison, the 4080 running under Port Royal was pulling about 300 to 315 watts and then holding steady at about 60-ish degrees, like low 60s. The 7900 XTX is about 10 degrees hotter at about 71 degrees reported package temp, whatever the regular GPU temp. AMD cards also report hotspot temp, and that temperature was 83 on this card. Nothing to be worried about at all. I mean, that's just the laws of thermodynamics, right? Smaller heatsink equals runs slightly hotter, but it doesn't really run that much louder. I mean, this is Gamers Nexus Steve level of nitpicking with like a calibrated microphone measured exactly 1 foot away and like checking out the dBA and the dBB and whatever other dBs. It runs slightly warmer, but nothing to be really alarmed about compared to the 4080. And if it's giving you the same performance, then, you know, I think I'll pick the one that fits in my case. Power draw is kind of interesting though, because the AMD card is actually pulling a little bit more wattage than the 4080. I saw an interesting behavior actually with the AMD cards and their power draw. They pretty much just locked straight at their TDP. I saw 340 to maybe 345 watts on the XTX underneath a very heavy load like Port Royal or Cyberpunk RT. Those temps though, 71 degrees at 300, almost 350 watts is pretty impressive for a cooler, like a standard size GPU. But the 4080 was giving you that same performance and better in RT for 300 to 315 watts and about 10 degrees cooler. So I don't really think that that's an advantage or a disadvantage necessarily for either card. I think it's, like I said earlier, it's just the laws of thermodynamics. Man, you got a bigger heatsink on this guy, it's gonna run cooler. Fans are bigger, so they have to run less RPM, which means it's gonna run slightly quieter, but I couldn't really tell in my testing audibly a difference between these cards. They all run extremely quiet. If you want a giant, like 4090 sized cooler or something on one of these cards, I'm sure the AIBs are going to have your back on that one. But yeah, 71 degrees, 83 a hotspot on this thing, pulling about 345 watts. The XT, by comparison, was 315-ish, which was exactly its rated TDP, and it was significantly cooler than the 7900 XTX at 63 degrees on the reported GPU temp and 75 on the hotspot. So yeah, 345 watts through some good old 8-pin PCI connectors, and in a form factor for both cards that'll pretty much fit in most any case. Personally, I think it's freaking sick. Like, for $200 cheaper than 4080 and you're getting the same rasterization performance and you're taking a little bit of a hit on RT. I mean, yeah, I'm an RT snob, but I would probably take that hit just because this fits in my NR200p Max and this does not. So what do you guys think? Are you guys gonna try to fit a 7900 XTX or 7900 XT into your system, or are you gonna stick with the ray tracing king, the good old GeForce 40 series, because you want all the bells and whistles when it comes to calculating light bounces through your portals? It's a great time to be a hardware enthusiast these days. We got really close battles left and right across all sorts of components, CPUs and GPUs trading blows between manufacturers and stuff. So it's just whoever you go with, you're gonna be getting an awesome product. But that was my personal take. Let's hear what Jay had to say about it. Cool. I'm sure that clip was full of lots of in-depth and very useful information. But yeah, the 7900 XTX is a really impressive card, especially for its price. They said they were gonna come out and battle the 4080, and it looks like they did it with the 7900 XTX. So what do you guys think of these two cards? Sound off in the comments down below, and as always, we'll see you in the next one. All right, guys, so while Jay's on vacation, he's been he's, another interesting result that, I don't know why I coughed. This is so hard. Jay, help! And it was significantly, it's a great time to be a hardware enthusiast these days. So yeah, I mean, it's a great time to be a hardware enthusiast. So yeah, it's a great time to be a hardware enthusiast. So yeah, it's a great time to be a hardware enthusiast.